Golden Blooded back with another video just for you, the college football fans. So if you are a college football fan, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button. Look, it's a long off season, but I'm here to get you through it. We also have a great Patreon page. We're putting a lot of time and effort into that, and I call my Patreons the shot callers. I let them decide who I do previews and predictions on first. We also have a great website designed by Joey Foster and great writers led by head writer Michael Walker. Happy Mother's Day to all you mothers out there. Special shout out to my wife. She's a great mother. And hey, even though there's only one day a year that honors our mothers, we should honor our mothers every single day for what they do for us. Today we're going to be talking about the ACC, specifically strength of schedule. Who has the toughest schedule and who has the easiest schedule in the ACC? The criteria that I used was road games, who they played on those road games, and out-of-conference games. We'll start from the easiest schedule and work our way up to the toughest schedule. And I'm sure you're going to disagree with me with some of these rankings, so let me know in the comments after you're done watching this video. Coming in at dead last in the ACC, the easiest schedule. And this is the reason why they aren't going away this year. I'm talking about Wake Forest. They have a lot of talent coming back on that offense, but this schedule sets up quite nicely for Wake Forest. First, they get VMI at home, then they go on the road to Vanderbilt, then they get Liberty at home, then a key game against Clemson at home, then they go on the road to Florida State, and they come back home and get Army, then they get their bye week, then a home game against Boston College, then they go on the road to Louisville, they stay on the road to NC State, come back home for North Carolina, and another home game for Syracuse, and then finally a road trip to Duke. That's 5 road games and an easy out of conference. That's why Wake Forest has the easiest schedule in the ACC. So in that fact alone, Wake Forest will be a contender once again in the Atlantic. Coming in at number 13, the second easiest schedule in the ACC, and that's going to be Virginia. I think Virginia is going to be contenders in the ACC Coastal this year. Here's a look at their schedule. They start the season with a home game against Richmond, and a tricky road trip to Illinois. Then they come back home to Old Dominion, at Syracuse, at Duke, home game against Louisville, then their bye week, and they go on the road to Georgia Tech, a home game against the Canes of Miami, another home game against North Carolina, another home game against Pitt, another home game against Coastal Carolina, and then finally they finish off the season on the road against Virginia Tech. So a total of 5 road games, nothing all that difficult, and a 4-game home stretch. That's a pretty good schedule right there. I think you gotta watch out for Virginia in the Coastal this year. Coming in at number 12, I have Virginia Tech, the Hokies. Their schedule is a little tricky, but it's not one of the more difficult schedules. They start off the season with a weird road trip to Old Dominion, and they come back home and play Boston College, then Wofford, then West Virginia. That's a key out-of-conference game for them. Then they go back on the road to North Carolina, stay on the road for Pitt. They come back home for Miami, then they get their bye week, then on the road to NC State, Georgia Tech at home, at Duke, at Liberty, then Virginia at home. That's 6 road games, but most of them are fairly easy. Old Dominion, at Duke, at Liberty, those aren't all that difficult, but you gotta watch out for the road trips to North Carolina and Pitt. In NC State, don't forget about NC State. They're gonna be pretty good. Coming in at number 11, that's gonna be Duke. Here's a look at their schedule. A home game against Temple, then on the road to Northwestern, then back home to FCS North Carolina A&T, road trip to Kansas, back home for Virginia, road trip to Georgia Tech, back home for North Carolina, road trip for Miami, then they get their bye week, and they go back on the road for Boston College, come back home for Virginia Tech, back on the road for Pitt, and then they come back home for Wake Forest. Duke has 6 road games, but some of them fairly easy. I mean, at Northwestern, at Kansas, at Georgia Tech, not all that difficult, but they do have to watch out for at Miami and at Pitt. Coming in at number 10, North Carolina. Here's a look at their schedule. Start off the season with a home game against Florida A&M, at Appalachian State, at Georgia State, bye week, come back home for Notre Dame, home game against Virginia Tech as well, then back on the road to Miami, stay on the road for Duke, get another bye week, then a home game against Pitt, then on the road to Virginia, on the road to Wake Forest, back home for Georgia Tech, another home game for NC State. So a total of 6 road games for North Carolina, a tricky one against Appalachian State, tough road trip against Miami, then a tough road trip against Wake Forest. So they have a little bit of a tougher schedule. Moving on to number 9, that's going to be NC State. Here's a look at their schedule. A weird and tricky road trip to East Carolina to open the season. Then they get FCS Charleston Southern. Then they're out of conferences, Texas Tech at home. Then they get UConn at home. Then they go on the road to Clemson, come back home for Florida State, then on the road to Syracuse. Then they get their bye week. Then a 3-game home stretch with Virginia Tech, Wake Forest, and Boston College. And then 2 road trips to end the season at Louisville and at North Carolina. That's a little bit of a tricky schedule right there. 5 road games, some of them tough, at Clemson, at Louisville, at North Carolina, and then that weird road trip to start the year at East Carolina. Coming in at number 8, this is going to be Clemson. Yeah, they don't have one of the more difficult schedules in the ACC this year. It was a different story last year. They start off this season on the road to Georgia Tech, and 2 home games against Furman and Louisiana Tech, then on the road to Wake Forest, then back home to NC State, back on the road to Boston College, stay on the road for Florida State, come back home for Syracuse, then they get their bye week, then probably the biggest game of the season at Notre Dame, then a 3-game home slate slate to end the year, starting with Louisville, then Miami, then South Carolina. So there is some difficulty to this schedule, but it's definitely not the hardest schedule. Coming in at number 7, so now we're getting into the upper half, the more difficult schedules, and this is going to be Syracuse. They start off with the home game against Louisville, and they go on the road to UConn. That's a weird one. Then they get a 4-game home slate. Purdue, Virginia, Wagner, then a bye week, then NC State, then they go on the road to Clemson, then they get Notre Dame at home, and they go back on the road for Pitt, come back home for Florida State, then back on the road for Wake Forest, and stay on the road for Boston College. This has some tricky road trips. Clemson, Pitt, Wake Forest. That's 3 difficult road trips, and you're out of conference with Purdue. So this is a pretty decent schedule. Coming in at number 6 is going to be Pitt. They have some tough opponents in the beginning of the year, but those are at home, but the end of the year is full of road trips. The first game is going to be the backyard brawl against West Virginia. And if you've been keeping up with the offseason, it looks like things are drastically swinging in the favor of West Virginia. After that, they get Tennessee at home, then a tricky road trip to Western Michigan, who beat them at Pitt last year. They get FCS Rhode Island at home, Georgia Tech at home, and Virginia Tech at home, then a bye week. This is where their road slate really beefs up. At Louisville, at North Carolina, they do come back home for Syracuse, back on the road to Virginia, come back home to Duke, and then finally on the road to the Hurricanes of Miami. That back half of their schedule is a tough one. And even though they get some home games in the beginning of the season, a lot of those home games are against difficult opponents. Coming in at number 5, Boston College. They start off the season with a home game against Rutgers, then at Virginia Tech, then FCS Maine at home, then back on the road to Florida State, come back home for Louisville and Clemson, then they get their bye week, back on the road to Wake Forest, stay on the road for UConn, come back home for Duke, a road trip to NC State, and another road trip to Notre Dame, finally a home game against Syracuse. That's 6 road games. You got Wake Forest, NC State, and Notre Dame, and then a tricky one against Virginia Tech. Those are some tough road trips. So quality and quantity when it comes to those road trips for Boston College. Coming in at number 4 is going to be Florida State. They start off the season with FCS Duquesne, then a neutral site game against LSU, but that's in New Orleans. That's basically going to be a home game for LSU. Then they get their first bye week. Then they go on the road to Louisville, come back home to Boston College, another home game against Wake Forest, back on the road against NC State, come back home for Clemson, then they get their second bye week, then a home game against Georgia Tech, then on the road to the Canes of Miami, stay on the road to Syracuse, come back home for Louisiana and Florida. So their out of conference is crazy. They get LSU, Louisiana, and Florida. That is a difficult out of conference. But to kind of counterbalance that, they only have 4 true road games. Coming in at number 3 is going to be Louisville. They have a tricky schedule this year. They start off the season with 2 road trips. First, a road trip to Syracuse, then a road trip to UCF. They come back home for Florida State, another home game against South Florida, back on the road to Boston College, stay on the road for Virginia, then they get their bye week, then a home game against Pitt, a home game against Wake Forest, a home game against FCS powerhouse James Madison, then back on the road to Clemson, back home to NC State, and then finally a road trip to Kentucky. This is a very difficult schedule. 6 road trips, and their out of conference is crazy. But there are 2 schedules that are more difficult than this in the ACC. Coming in at number 2 is going to be the Miami Hurricanes. First, FCS Bethune-Cookman at home, they get Southern Miss at home, then a crazy road trip to Texas A&M. That is going to be their most difficult road trip of the year. Probably the most difficult road trip of any team in the ACC when it comes to out of conference. Then back home to Middle Tennessee, they get their bye week, then a home game against North Carolina, at Virginia Tech, Duke at home, at Virginia, a home game against Florida State, then a road trip to Georgia Tech, another road trip to Clemson, and then back home to Pitt. So they have a total of 5 road trips at Texas A&M, at Virginia Tech, at Virginia, at Georgia Tech, and at Clemson. This is a very difficult schedule, but if they can somehow shock Texas A&M, that greatly increases the chances of Miami having a 10-win season and winning the Coastal. I know it doesn't count towards the ACC rankings, but it would definitely help mentally if they were able to go on the road and beat Texas A&M. Then there's the most difficult schedule in the ACC, and that's going to be Georgia Tech. And Georgia Tech's trying to rebuild, get out of that triple option, but the schedule is not doing them any favors this year. They start off the season with a home game against Clemson, but it's still Clemson. Then they get FCS Western Carolina at home. Then they get Ole Miss at home. So that's Clemson and Ole Miss. Yes, they are home games, but that is crazy to start out the season with. Then 2 tough road trips at UCF and at Pitt. And they finally get a breather with Duke at home. Then they get their bye week. Then they get Virginia at home. Then 2 road trips at Florida State and at Virginia Tech. They do get Miami at home. Then back on the road to North Carolina. Stay on the road to Georgia. This is an insane schedule, guys. So they start off the season with Clemson and Ole Miss. Yes, they are home games, but man, that is a rough start to your season. Then after that, 2 tough road trips at UCF and at Pitt. And at the end of the year, you have 4 out of your 5 games on the road. At Florida State, at Virginia Tech, at North Carolina, and at Georgia. This is an insane schedule. 6 road trips and a crazy out of conference. Good luck, Georgia Tech. Hey, if you get 4 wins, that'll be an accomplishment. If you get to a bowl, that would be a miracle. This is a tough schedule. Y'all let me know in the comments what you think about my rankings of the ACC schedules. Do you agree or do you disagree with me? And if you do disagree, how would you rank them? That's all I got for you for this show. Like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you on my next show.